Brewing your own beer at home is perfectly legal. Making your own wine, legal. But distill that exact same beer into whiskey in that exact same kitchen, and you have just committed a federal felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Same house, same ingredients. One step apart. One is a hobby, the other is a crime. Why? The answer is stranger than you think. It was never really about the alcohol or even about safety. And right now, in 2026, that century-and-a-half-old law is being torn apart in federal court. Here's what almost everyone assumes. If you can brew a little beer for yourself, you can probably make a little liquor for yourself too, as long as you don't sell it, just for personal use. What's the harm? It feels obvious. It is also completely wrong. There is no personal use exception for spirits. None. Not a small amount, not for your own cabinet, not just this once. The federal rule is blunt. You may only produce distilled spirits at a registered, licensed facility the government calls a distilled spirits plant, a real, permitted, taxable operation. Your kitchen is not one. Your garage is not one. And the government's own tax agency says it in plain words. Federal law provides no exemption for making distilled spirits for personal or family use. And to be clear about what we're even talking about, beer and wine are made by fermentation, yeast-eating sugar, which naturally stops around 10 to 15% alcohol. Distilling takes that fermented liquid, boils it, and captures the vapor to push the alcohol much higher. That single extra step, concentration, is the line between a legal hobby and a federal crime. And the law does not care how much you make. Producing distilled spirits without being an authorized distiller is a federal offense. Full stop. One drop counts. The penalty for running an unregistered still runs up to $10,000 and 5 years in prison per offense. That is not a ticket, that is a felony. So how did we get a country where beer is a weekend hobby and whiskey is a prison sentence? The split goes back to one specific law. Here's a quirk most people don't know. Home winemaking had been legal since the end of Prohibition, but home beer, through a drafting slip in that same era, got left out and stayed technically illegal for decades. Then, in 1978, President Carter signed a bill that finally legalized home brewing of beer too, for personal use, up to 100 gallons a year for one adult, 200 for a household. So, by the end of the 1970s, both beer and wine could be made at home, legally, but spirits were pointedly, deliberately left out. Congress opened the door for the fermenters and locked it for the distillers. So, why leave spirits out? Here is the whole secret of this video. It was never mainly about the alcohol. It is about a tax. The federal government places a heavy excise tax on distilled spirits, collected at that licensed plant before the bottle ever reaches you. Home distilling doesn't get taxed, and that, legally, is the actual crime. Not that you made alcohol, but that you made spirits outside the tax system. Think about what that means. Take 2 identical glasses of whiskey, one poured from a licensed distillery, one from a still in someone's basement. Chemically, they can be the very same drink. One is a legal product, the other is a felony. And the only difference between them is a tax stamp, not the substance in the glass. That's the strange heart of it. The law isn't really banning a liquid, it's protecting a tax. And that tax is almost as old as the country itself. In 1791, to help pay off the debt from the Revolution, Alexander Hamilton pushed through the young nation's very first tax on a product made at home, an excise on distilled spirits. Frontier farmers were furious. For them, turning surplus grain into whiskey was how they made money, and now the new federal government wanted a cut. The anger boiled into open revolt. By 1794, it was a rebellion. Tax collectors were attacked, homes were burned. So President George Washington did something no sitting American president has done before or since. He climbed onto a horse, took personal command of an army of roughly 13,000 men, and marched not against a foreign enemy, but against his own citizens, to collect a tax on whiskey. The rebellion collapsed without a real battle, but the message was permanent. The federal government could tax you, and it would enforce that tax with an army if it had to. That's where the word even comes from. To dodge the tax collectors, distillers worked at night by the light of the moon, Moonshine, and the agents sent to hunt them down through the hills had a name too, revenuers. Not because anyone cared what people were drinking, but because the government wanted its revenue. The whole cat and mouse legend of Moonshine was, underneath, a story about unpaid taxes. That job never went away. It just changed uniforms. The agency that once chased moonshiners eventually became part of what we now call the ATF. And then in 2003, the tax side split off into its own Treasury Bureau, the TTB. Today, it's not a police force that governs home distilling. It's a tax bureau, which tells you everything about what this law is really for. Now, a lot of people assume this all traces back to Prohibition. It doesn't. Prohibition, the total ban on alcohol from 1920 to 1933, supercharged the culture of moonshine, the bootleggers, the stills in the woods. But home distilling was already a federal crime decades before Prohibition began because of the tax, and it stayed a crime after Prohibition was repealed. The drinking ban came and went. The tax never left. There is one more rationale you'll hear: safety. Bad distilling can concentrate methanol, which really can cause blindness or worse. That risk is real, and badly made liquor really did kill and blind people, especially during Prohibition. But here's the key legal point. Safety has never been the actual foundation of the ban. When distillers recently challenged the law in court, the government defended it on tax collection, not health. The law is a revenue law, first and foremost. So, does that mean even owning the equipment is illegal? Actually, no. Owning a still can be perfectly legal. People use them to distill water, make essential oils, or produce fuel alcohol under a separate permit. The law only requires you to register a still if you intend to use it to make drinkable spirits. So, the copper still itself isn't contraband. It's what you do with it, and whether the taxman gets his cut, that flips it into a crime. Now here's where it gets genuinely confusing, because you may have heard that some states allow home distilling, and a few technically do, but this is the same trap as legal marijuana. A state can pass a law saying it won't punish you. That does not erase the federal crime. Take Missouri. Missouri law genuinely lets an adult make spirits at home for personal or family use, up to the same kind of limits as beer and wine, as long as you don't sell it. On paper, under state law, you're fine. But federal law still applies in Missouri. The state has simply promised not to be the one to prosecute you. The federal government makes no such promise. Legal in your state, still a federal crime, exactly like weed. And be careful with what you read online. A lot of your state just legalized moonshine claims are simply false. Texas, for example, considered a home distilling bill in 2025, but it died in the legislature. It never became law. Arizona still requires you to register any still, with no personal exception for spirits. So before anyone believes a headline, the reality is, almost everywhere, and federally everywhere, making your own spirits is still a crime. Or, at least, it was that simple until very recently. Because after more than a century and a half, that ban is now cracking in real time in the federal courts. A group of hobby distillers had sued back in 2023. And in 2024, a federal judge in Texas ruled something startling, that the specific ban on distilling in your own home was unconstitutional because it exceeds the government's power to tax. Then it went up on appeal, and in April 2026, a federal appeals court, the Fifth Circuit, agreed. The court's logic cut to the heart of this video. A law that flatly forbids you from distilling isn't really a tax at all. A tax charges you for doing something. This law just prohibits it. And preventing an activity to protect a future tax, the court said, goes beyond the taxing power. But, and this matters, that ruling only binds 3 states, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And even there, you'd still need a permit and still owe the tax. And then something remarkable happened. Just 11 days later, a different federal appeals court, the Sixth Circuit, looked at the exact same law and ruled the opposite way. It upheld the ban, calling it a perfectly proper tool for collecting the spirits tax. So now we have 2 federal appeals courts, same law, same question, opposite answers, 11 days apart. Which one governs you? Right now, it depends entirely on your zip code. When 2 appeals courts split like that, there's usually only one place the fight can end, the Supreme Court. And that's exactly where it may be going. The losing side has asked the Supreme Court to step in and settle it. As of now, the court has not agreed to hear it, and has not decided anything. But this 235-year-old question, can the government make it a crime to distill in your own home, may finally get a national answer. So, should home distilling be legal, like home brewing? Honest people disagree, and this isn't the place to pick a side. Both sides are staring at the same question the founders fought over. How far can the government go to protect a tax? For the record, there is a legal way to distill. You get a federal permit, register as a distilled spirits plant, post a bond if required, pay the excise tax, and get your state license too. That's how every legal craft distillery operates. The door isn't sealed shut. It's just a licensed, taxed, non-residential door. The whole fight is about whether your kitchen can ever be on the other side of it. So, what does this actually mean for you? This is general education, not legal advice, and definitely not a how-to. The bottom line, in almost the entire country, distilling spirits at home is still a federal felony, no matter how little you make or that it's just for you. In 3 states, one court has carved out an exception for now, and even there, the tax and permit rules still apply. And the whole thing could change again with one Supreme Court decision. Step back, and the whole arc is really one long story about a tax. 235 years, and the country is still arguing about the same thing, a tax on whiskey. So, back to where we started. Your neighbor brews beer in his garage, totally legal. You distill that same beer into whiskey. And in most of America, you've committed a federal crime, not because the whiskey is more dangerous, not because of some morality law, but because of a tax first imposed when George Washington was president and enforced once by Washington himself at the head of an army. So, the honest answer to the title question is really 2 answers. Is it illegal to make your own moonshine? For most of the country, yes, a federal felony, purely because of the tax, no personal use exception. In 3 states, a court has just said no, at least for now. Same law, same country, and for the first time in a century and a half, no longer a settled question. Which leaves the real fight, the one now sitting at the Supreme Court's doorstep. Can the federal government make it a crime to do something in your own home, not because it's dangerous, but to protect a tax? One court said no, another said yes. The founders went to war over a gentler version of this exact question. Where that line belongs between your kitchen and the tax man, that part, you get to decide. So, is it illegal to make your own moonshine? Almost everywhere, yes. And the reason isn't the alcohol, it's the tax that's been chasing that still since 1791. But that answer is cracking, court by court, for the first time in generations. Beer built you a legal door in 1978. Whiskey is still trying to get through it. Now you know why, now you know.